The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched across the windshield in layers of fading green and gray, each ridge darker than the last until they dissolved into October mist. Jake Carter kept his hand steady on the wheel of the rented
Congratulations,
Chevy
you
Malibu,
look stunning.
the kind
Thank
of
you so
vehicle that
much.
announced
I can't
nothing
believe this
except
is real.
practicality
Enjoy
and
it.
modest income. He'd driven 300 miles today from Charleston to Asheville, and the journey felt less like travel and more like pilgrimage, returning to collect a debt 16 years overdue. 16 years. That's how long it takes for a wound to scar over while still bleeding underneath. The thought settled in his mind with the weight of something he'd carried so long it had become part of his skeleton. In the passenger seat lay a cream-colored invitation with gold-embossed lettering, elegant script announcing the marriage of Claire Sterling and Andrew Bennett at the Asheville Grand Estate. The paper stock was expensive, the kind that whispered old money and careful breeding. Jake had examined it under different light 3 times, looking for watermarks for any sign of forgery. It was real. He'd obtained it through channels that would hold up under legal scrutiny, though the bride had no idea he was coming. His phone buzzed against the center console. Ryan Chen, FBI. All teams in position. Recording equipment tested and operational. Remember the objective, solid evidence, not personal vendetta. Stay professional. Jake pulled to the shoulder before the final turn, letting the engine idle while he typed back with thumbs that had sorted through 847 rejected housing applications but still trembled over simple text messages. Understood. Beginning documentation now. Another message arrived before he could set the phone down. Jake, your family's application was one of 847. Don't lose sight of the bigger picture. He didn't reply to that one. Ryan meant well, but he hadn't been the one sleeping in a $40 a night motel at age 14 listening to his mother cry through walls so thin they might as well have been paper. Ryan hadn't watched his father's hands shake over morning coffee, a proud man reduced to wondering what invisible flaw in their family had made them unworthy of a simple 2-bedroom apartment. Jake slipped the phone into his jacket pocket and checked his appearance in the rearview mirror. The suit was off the rack from a department store in Charleston, serviceable but unremarkable. His tie was navy blue conservative, the kind worn by men who work for the government and don't particularly care about fashion. He'd shaved carefully that morning, leaving no trace of stubble, no excuse for dismissal. His hair was cut short, professional. Nothing about his appearance should trigger alarm. Just a man in a suit. Just another wedding guest. Except the invitation in his pocket wasn't addressed to Jake Carter. It was addressed to David Morrison, a name borrowed from the FBI's witness protection database for this particular operation. Claire Sterling had no idea who David Morrison was, thought he was Andrew's colleague from the investment firm. She was about to learn how wrong assumptions could be. The Asheville Grand Estate announced itself through a gatehouse designed to evoke colonial grandeur while incorporating modern security systems that tracked every approaching vehicle. 2 attendants in burgundy vests directed traffic with the practiced efficiency of airline ground crew routing luxury sedans and imported SUVs toward a sprawling parking area disguised as a pastoral meadow. Jake followed a BMW and a Mercedes, his rental Malibu looking appropriately out of place among the European imports. He parked in the 3rd row and sat for a moment watching other guests emerge from their vehicles. The men wore tuxedos or expensive suits in charcoal and midnight blue, their watches catching the slanting sunlight. The women navigated gravel pathways in heels that cost more than Jake's monthly car payment, their jewelry understated in the way that only genuine wealth could afford. These were people accustomed to events like this, to celebrations that cost what most families earned in a year. Jake had attended events like this before as an investigator documenting discrimination, building cases against people who used their wealth as a weapon against those who had less. He pulled a small digital recorder from the glove compartment, no larger than a USB drive. FBI issued court-approved, capable of capturing audio in high definition for up to 12 hours. He clipped it inside his jacket pocket, the microphone positioned near the lapel, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. His phone was already set to record video if needed, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Obvious documentation made people nervous. Better to let them perform their casual cruelties naturally, unprompted by the awareness of witnesses. The walk from parking area to main entrance took him past gardens designed by someone who understood that beauty could be weaponized, that the careful arrangement of heirloom roses and native azaleas could communicate exclusivity more effectively than any gate. A fountain burbled at the center of a circular drive, its basin decorated with hand-painted tiles that probably dated back a century. Old money, or at least money old enough to have learned the aesthetics of aristocracy. The front steps were granite worn smooth in the centers, where generations of feet had climbed toward whatever celebrations the wealthy deemed worthy of their presence. Jake ascended slowly, aware of the security camera mounted above the entrance, its lens tracking his approach with mechanical indifference. The doors stood open, held by attendants in formal livery, who nodded to each arriving guest with practiced warmth. Jake approached the one on the left, a young man barely out of his teens, whose smile faltered slightly as he registered Jake's presence. The couple ahead of him, matching Rolex watches' designer labels, visible even from behind, breezed past, with nothing more than a cheerful greeting. No verification, no credential check. The attendant turned his attention to Jake. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to the Sterling Bennett wedding." The words were polite enough, but the tone carried a question that other guests hadn't triggered. "May I see your invitation?" Jake produced it from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with care. The attendant examined it with an intensity that bordered on suspicious, turning it over twice as if checking for signs of forgery. His eyes moved from the printed name David Morrison plus guest to Jake's face and back again, a calculation happening behind that practiced smile. "Mr. Morrison, is it?" "That's right." "And your guest?" He glanced past Jake, searching for someone who wasn't there. "Couldn't make it. Work emergency." The lie came easily rehearsed during the drive up from Charleston. Jake watched the attendant's face for signs of acceptance or rejection. 3 seconds passed. 5. The smile never wavered, but something in the young man's posture had shifted, a subtle stiffening of the shoulders that suggested he was preparing to call for backup. Then, as if remembering his training, he stepped aside. "Of course, sir. Please enjoy the celebration." But his hand moved to the radio at his belt as Jake passed, and a whispered conversation began before the doors had even closed behind him. The grand ballroom opened up like a cathedral dedicated to secular luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, painted in soft creams and golds, their light scattering across walls, decorated with silk panels and antique mirrors. Round tables draped in ivory linen filled the space. Each centerpiece a sculpture of white roses and trailing ivy that probably cost more than Jake's weekly salary. At the far end, beneath an arch of flowers that must have required a team of designers, a string quartet played something classical and vaguely familiar. The kind of music that signaled refinement without demanding actual attention. 200 guests, maybe more, already filling the room with the particular noise of the wealthy at leisure. Laughter that rang with confidence. Conversations that assumed shared reference points. The clink of champagne flutes against perfect teeth. Jake stood just inside the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed not by the grandeur, but by the calculation it represented. Every detail had been chosen, every element designed to communicate a single message: you are among the elite, the chosen, the deserving. Unless you weren't. The shift in atmosphere was subtle, but immediate. A ripple of awareness spreading through the nearest clusters of guests. Conversations didn't stop, but they changed tenor, voices dropping slightly as eyes flicked in his direction and away again. Jake had experienced this before, this particular form of social mathematics where newcomers were assessed and categorized in seconds. He'd learned to recognize the moment when people decided he didn't quite fit, didn't quite belong. A woman in her 60s, silver hair styled in a way that probably required weekly appointments, leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind a hand heavy with emeralds. Her companion, equally coiffed and jeweled, glanced at Jake with a kind of casual disdain, usually reserved for service staff who'd made a mistake. Jake walked deeper into the ballroom, looking for his table assignment. A seating chart stood on an easel near the entrance, names arranged in elegant calligraphy under table numbers. He found Morris and David listed at table 12, all the way at the back of the room near the kitchen service entrance, where waiters appeared and disappeared with practiced invisibility. Table 12 had no other names listed. He approached slowly, watching the space around him as he moved. Other guests navigated the room with the ease of people who knew they belonged, pausing to exchange embraces and air kisses, forming and reforming social clusters with fluid grace. No one met his eyes. When he passed too close to a conversation, the group would shift slightly, closing their circle without appearing to exclude him, a choreography so practiced it seemed instinctive. Table 12 stood empty when he arrived, all 10 chairs vacant despite the room's growing crowd. Jake pulled out a chair facing the main floor and sat down, folding his hands on the pristine tablecloth. From here, he had a clear view of the entire ballroom of the entrance where guests still arrived, of the head table where the bride and groom would eventually sit. A waiter passed his table carrying a tray of champagne flutes, crystal catching light like small stars. Jake raised a hand slightly, a subtle gesture requesting service. The waiter's eyes slid past him as if he were transparent, moving on to a nearby table where 3 couples had just settled, distributing glasses with professional efficiency and a warm smile. Jake lowered his hand and made a note in his phone. 12:47 p.m. Monsieur, table service denied. Waiter bypassed subject, served adjacent table immediately after. The phone sat on the table now, its screen dark, but its memory recording every detail. 6 years of investigation had taught Jake that patterns mattered more than individual incidents. Discrimination revealed itself through accumulation rather than dramatic confrontation. One denied drink meant nothing but one drink, plus a questioned invitation, plus isolation at an empty table, plus the whispered conversations and averted eyes that began to look like something systematic. His father's voice echoed in memory, roughened by years of coal dust and disappointment. "Jake, son, real discrimination doesn't shout. It smiles politely and closes the door right in your face." Dennis Carter had been right about that, as he'd been right about so many things. The old man had spent 30 years descending into West Virginia mines, emerging each evening gray with dust and exhausted beyond what any body should endure, and he'd done it with a dignity that no amount of corporate rejection could diminish. Even when Sterling Property Group had denied their application for a simple apartment, a family with perfect credit, steady employment, a decorated military veteran father, and a registered nurse mother, Dennis had maintained his composure. But Jake remembered the night his father sat at their motel kitchenette, holding the rejection letter in hands that trembled with something beyond exhaustion. Not sufficient financial qualifications, the letter had read. A lie so transparent it insulted their intelligence. His mother had cried quietly in the next room, the sound seeping through walls that seemed designed to amplify misery rather than contain it. His younger sister Emily had asked why they couldn't live in the nice apartments like her friends from school, her 9-year-old confusion sharp as accusation. That night had planted something in Jake, a seed that took years to grow but never withered. Justice delayed is justice denied, the saying went. But sometimes delay was strategic, a matter of gathering strength and evidence until the moment was right. 16 years, and now the moment had arrived. The ballroom continued filling around him, guests flowing toward assigned tables with the confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to occupy space. Jake observed them with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years studying systems of exclusion, noting the small gestures that reinforced hierarchy. The way certain guests were greeted with embraces while others received only nods. How some tables attracted clusters of visitors while others sat ignored. Which families clearly held power and which existed on its periphery, hoping for attention. Table 7, he noticed, seemed to function as a gravitational center. The patriarch there, a man in his 70s, silver-haired and military straight despite his age, held court while a rotation of guests approached to pay respects. His wife sat beside him, a woman whose posture suggested she'd spent a lifetime as social gatekeeper, her smile warm for some arrivals and merely polite for others. Colonel William Sterling and his wife Victoria. Jake recognized them from 6 years of photograph surveillance and background investigation. The faces had aged slightly since the most recent photos in his files, but the essential quality remained that particular arrogance that comes from generations of unchallenged power, from building an empire on the premise that some people simply deserved more than others. The colonel laughed at something a younger man said, his hand clapping the visitor's shoulder with paternal approval. Victoria leaned forward to add some comment that sent the group into appreciative chuckles. They looked, Jake thought, exactly like what they were, pillars of the community, respected leaders. The kind of people who chaired charitable boards and sponsored youth programs and made generous donations to the right causes. They also looked like people who'd built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire by systematically denying housing to families they deemed unworthy of their premium properties. People who'd developed software specifically designed to automate discrimination, then sold it to 11 other companies for $50,000 per license. People who'd weaponized the American dream, transforming the promise of home ownership into a tool for enforcing class boundaries that were all the more insidious for being invisible. Jake's phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. "Status check. You good?" He typed back quickly. "In position. Documentation proceeding normally. Sterling family present at table 7. Remember the rules. Observe. Record. Do not engage unless necessary. Understood." But the rules were about to change whether Ryan liked it or not. This wasn't just surveillance anymore. This was the final act of a drama that had been building for 16 years, and Jake intended to see it through to its conclusion. A waiter appeared at his table, different from the first, younger, with nervous energy that suggested recent hiring. The young man placed a glass of water on the table with a slight tremor in his hand, not quite meeting Jake's eyes. "Sir, can I get you anything from the bar?" "Champagne, please. Whatever you're serving." The waiter nodded and vanished toward the service entrance, moving quickly as if eager to complete the task and escape. Jake waited, watching the flow of staff through the room. Other waiters circulated with trays offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres with practiced grace. His waiter did not return. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Jake made another note. 1:03 p.m. Requested champagne from waiter number 2. No service provided after 10-minute wait. Observation: all other tables receiving continuous service. At table 3, a woman in her 40s gestured vaguely toward a passing waiter, not even speaking, and received a fresh glass within seconds. At table 9, an elderly couple was offered their choice of 3 different appetizers from a silver tray. At table 12, Jake sat alone with a glass of water and the growing awareness that his isolation was not accidental. The ceremony itself began with the string quartet swelling into something romantic and vaguely familiar, a signal that brought conversations to a polite pause. Guests found their seats in a rustle of silk and linen, their attention turning toward the flower-draped arch where a minister in formal robes waited with the groom. Andrew Bennett stood straight-backed and nervous, his hands clasped in front of him, as he scanned the crowd with the forced smile of someone desperately hoping everything would go according to plan. He was younger than Jake expected, maybe 36, with the well-fed look of someone who'd never known real hunger or uncertainty. His tuxedo was flawless, his shoes polished to a gleam that suggested he'd never walked anywhere that might scuff them. The music changed, shifting to the traditional wedding march, and the guests rose as one. At the back of the ballroom, double doors opened to reveal the bride. Claire Sterling walked toward the altar on her father's arm, her dress a confection of French lace and silk that probably cost more than a year's rent in the apartments her family had systematically denied to families like Jake's. Her face glowed with the particular beauty of a woman on her wedding day, makeup artfully applied to enhance features that needed little enhancement. She looked happy, radiant, like someone beginning the best day of her life, free from the weight of past decisions and their consequences. Then her eyes found Jake. The change was instantaneous and total. Color drained from Claire's face so completely she might have been carved from marble. Her step faltered, and only her father's supportive grip kept her moving forward. Her smile froze into something that looked more like a grimace. Her eyes locked on Jake with the horrified recognition of someone seeing a ghost materialize in broad daylight. She knew him. Despite the 6 years since they'd been in the same room, despite his deliberately unremarkable appearance, she knew exactly who he was. And in that moment of recognition, Jake saw everything he needed to see. The guilt, the terror, the desperate calculation of someone trying to figure out how her past had found her here on this day in front of everyone she'd tried so hard to impress. Colonel Sterling remained oblivious to his daughter's distress, guiding her forward with paternal pride, his silver hair military straight despite his age, his posture suggesting decades of command. Claire whispered something as she reached the altar too low for most guests to hear. But Jake caught the shape of her lips forming words that looked like, "He's here," or "problem." Andrew leaned in concerned as the minister waited with practiced patience. Claire shook her head quickly, forcing her smile back into place. Whatever she'd been about to say, she swallowed it down, choosing to continue with the ceremony rather than create a scene. But her hands trembled as Andrew took them, and her voice cracked slightly on the first response to the minister's questions. Throughout the vows, her eyes kept drifting back to table 12, to the man sitting alone in the back corner, watching her with an expression of calm patience that must have terrified her more than any overt threat. The ceremony proceeded with all the traditional elements, readings about love and commitment, the exchange of rings that symbolized promises meant to last a lifetime, the kiss that sealed the union before God, and witnesses. Guests applauded politely as the new couple turned to face them, Claire's smile now fixed so firmly it looked painful. The photographer captured it all, her camera clicking through hundreds of images that would be carefully curated into an album celebrating this perfect day. None of those photos would include table 12 or the man who sat there making notes while everyone else applauded. Jake remained seated as other guests rose as the receiving line formed near the entrance as Claire and Andrew positioned themselves to greet well-wishers. He watched the choreography of it, the way certain guests received longer conversations while others were rushed through with perfunctory thanks, how Claire's smile brightened or dimmed depending on who approached. When Colonel Sterling passed through the line, Claire leaned into his embrace with the desperation of someone seeking protection from a threat she couldn't name. The colonel whispered something in her ear, and Claire's eyes cut toward table 12, then away again quickly. She nodded, her jaw set, and turned to the next guest with renewed determination. Jake stood and began walking toward the dance floor, moving slowly through the crowd. He had no intention of joining the receiving line, not yet. Better to let Claire's panic simmer, to watch the fear work its way through her nervous system like slow poison. Several guests noticed his approach, their conversations faltering as they tried to place this unremarkable man in the department store suit who carried himself with quiet purpose. But Jake didn't approach anyone. He simply moved to a position where Claire could see him clearly, where every glance in his direction would remind her that her past had caught up with her present. The DJ announced the first dance. Claire and Andrew took the floor, moving through a carefully choreographed waltz that suggested months of lessons. They looked perfect together, like figures on a wedding cake, all smooth surfaces and practiced grace. Jake set down his water glass and began walking toward the head table. He moved with purpose but without hurry, navigating between tables with the confidence of someone who had every right to be exactly where he was. Several guests noticed his approach, their conversations faltering as they tried to understand what was happening. Claire saw him coming. Jake watched the recognition bloom in the bride's eyes, watched her miss a step in the carefully rehearsed waltz, watched Andrew's confused expression as his new wife suddenly gripped his hand hard enough to hurt. But Jake didn't approach the dance floor. Instead, he stopped at table 7, where Colonel Sterling sat with several other men, all of them focused on their conversation about business or politics or whatever wealthy men in their 70s discussed when they weren't actively destroying lives. He waited, watched, let his presence become a question that demanded answering. Colonel Sterling turned mid-sentence, following the gaze of a companion who'd noticed Jake standing there. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, calculation, something that might have been recognition before his military training reasserted control. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "Can I help you?" Jake kept his voice level, professional. "Colonel Sterling, my name is Jake Carter. I'm a senior investigator with the Department of Housing and Urban Development Office of Fair Housing." The color began draining from the colonel's face. I've spent 6 years investigating housing discrimination practices in this region. During that time, I've documented systematic violations of the Fair Housing Act conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights and racketeering through the creation and distribution of software designed specifically to enable discriminatory practices. The other men at the table had gone very quiet. I've reviewed 847 housing applications that were rejected by Sterling Property Group and its affiliated companies between 2008 and 2019. I've analyzed the algorithms used in your tenant optimization system and traced its distribution to 11 other real estate companies across 4 states. Jake pulled his credentials from his jacket pocket, the leather folder containing his official HUD identification and badge. I've interviewed 73 families who were denied housing despite meeting every legal qualification, and I've compiled evidence showing a pattern of discrimination so systematic and deliberate that it constitutes federal racketeering. The colonel's hand shook slightly, his champagne glass trembling. "This is absurd. Our company follows all relevant housing laws." "Sir, I have emails from your servers. I have testimony from former employees. I have the source code for the discrimination software, including internal comments from developers that specifically reference filtering out undesirable elements. Those emails are privileged. They were obtained through legally executed subpoenas issued by a federal grand jury. Everything we have is admissible in court." The ballroom had gone quiet around them. Other guests, sensing that something significant was happening, though unable to hear the specifics of the conversation. Claire stood frozen at the head table, her face pale, her new husband looking between her and the confrontation with growing confusion. Colonel Sterling drew himself up to his full height, military bearing reasserting itself despite the shock. "I don't care what you think you have. I have lawyers, top lawyers, who will tear apart any case you try to build." Jake's expression didn't change. "I'm counting on it, sir. Every call you make, every favor you try to cash in, every attempt to interfere with a federal investigation, it all becomes evidence of obstruction. You're making a serious mistake, son." "No, sir. You made the mistake 16 years ago when you rejected a housing application from Dennis and Linda Carter. And you've been making that same mistake over and over with hundreds of other families who had the audacity to think they deserved a decent place to live." Understanding dawned in the colonel's eyes, sharp and sudden. "Carter, you're one of them. One of the applicants. My father was a coal miner. My mother was a registered nurse. They had perfect credit, stable employment, and more integrity in their little fingers than you've demonstrated in your entire life. And you denied them housing because they didn't fit your vision of what your community should look like." The colonel's face cycled through several emotions: shock, rage, calculation, and finally a kind of cold determination. "I see. This is personal vendetta dressed up as investigation. This is 6 years of solid investigative work that happens to have personal meaning. But personal doesn't mean wrong, sir. It means I cared enough to see it through." Before the colonel could respond, the ballroom doors opened. 3 men in dark suits entered, and Jake felt a wave of relief so profound it was almost dizzying. FBI right on schedule. Ryan Chen led them, his credentials already out, his face professionally neutral as he approached the group. "Colonel William Sterling." The colonel's voice came out strangled. "Yes." "I'm Special Agent Ryan Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights, housing discrimination, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The words continued, but Jake stopped listening. The colonel's face had gone from purple to gray, his champagne glass slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor. Victoria Sterling swayed, gripping her husband's arm for support. Claire began crying at the head table, her perfect wedding day collapsing into the nightmare she'd spent 6 years trying to outrun. And Jake stood in the center of it all, watching 16 years of patient investigation finally come to fruition, feeling not triumph or joy, but something quieter and heavier. The weight of justice delivered. Of promises kept to families who'd never known why their applications were rejected. Of a system held accountable for cruelties it had assumed would remain invisible forever. His phone buzzed. A message from his father. Saw the news alert. "You did it, son. Your mother would be proud. We're proud. But now come home. Let it be finished." Jake looked around the ballroom at the shocked faces, the ruined celebration, the FBI agents moving efficiently through their procedures. He thought about his mother crying in that motel room, about his father's trembling hands, about 847 families, and all the others they'd never found. And he typed back, "Coming home. It's finished." The FBI field office in Charlotte smelled like stale coffee and fluorescent light, its interior a maze of cubicles and conference rooms that had witnessed 1,000 interrogations. Jake sat across from Claire Sterling in interview room B, watching her transform from radiant bride to federal witness in the space of 72 hours. She'd changed out of her wedding dress finally, though traces of the day remained, mascara smudges beneath her eyes that no amount of washing had completely removed a pale line around her ring finger where the wedding band had been before her lawyer advised removing it pending the investigation. Ryan Chen sat beside Jake, a digital recorder spinning silently between them. Claire's attorney, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Hoffman, steel-gray hair, and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything twice, positioned herself like a barrier between her client and the federal agents. "My client has agreed to provide a voluntary statement regarding her employment at Sterling Property Group from 2015 to 2020. Patricia said, her voice crisp and professional. "She understands that anything she says can be used in subsequent legal proceedings, and she's waiving her Fifth Amendment rights in the interest of cooperation." Claire's hands twisted together on the table, her wedding ring absent, but the habit of turning it apparently ingrained. "I want to explain," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not to excuse anything, but to help you understand how it happened." Jake kept his expression neutral, professional. This was the moment he'd been working toward for 6 years. Not just the arrest, but the confession, the detailed accounting of how systematic discrimination had been built into software and sold as a legitimate business tool. "When I graduated law school in 2015, I had $180,000 in student loans," Claire continued. "My parents couldn't help. They'd already mortgaged their house to help with undergraduate. I applied to 63 law firms and got 2 offers. One was legal aid at $35,000 a year. The other was Sterling Property Group at $85,000. Ryan's pen moved across his notepad, capturing details. Patricia sat motionless, her face revealing nothing. "I thought I'd be doing real estate contracts, title work, standard corporate law. And I did do that at first. But about 3 months in, they moved me to a new project. Rental optimization, they called it. Making the application process more efficient." Jake had heard variations of this story before from other employees who'd participated in discrimination while telling themselves they were just doing their jobs. But he needed to hear Claire's version, needed her specific details for the case file. "They gave me a list of criteria," Claire said, her voice growing steadier as she fell into the rhythm of confession. "Zip codes to flag employer types, to scrutinize schools that should trigger additional review. At first I thought it was about financial stability, making sure applicants could actually afford the rent." She reached for a water bottle with trembling hands. "But then I started seeing the patterns. Families with perfect credit were being rejected. People with stable jobs, good references, everything by the book. And when I asked why, my supervisor, Michael Porter, he told me it was about maintaining community standards, about preserving property values, about making sure the right kind of people lived in Sterling developments." "Did you object?" Jake heard the edge in his own voice and tried to soften it. This wasn't an interrogation. Not officially. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Yes. Once. I went to HR and said I was uncomfortable with some of the criteria. They called me into a meeting with Porter and the general counsel. Told me that if I continued raising concerns, they'd report me to the state bar for ethics violations. Said I'd breached confidentiality by discussing internal processes. That I'd never work as a lawyer again." Ryan looked up from his notes. "Did you get that threat in writing?" "No, they were careful. Everything was verbal off the record. But I was 25 and terrified and drowning in debt. So I kept my head down and did what they told me." Jake watched her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What he saw instead was shame so profound it seemed to radiate from her like heat. "The software came later," Claire said. 2017, I think. They wanted to automate the process, make it faster. I helped design the algorithm." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I wrote the code that filtered applications based on zip codes. I created the weighting system that flagged certain employer types. I built the thing that did automatically what I'd been doing manually." "And then Sterling sold it," Jake said. Not a question. "To 11 other companies. $50,000 per license. I got a bonus. $45,000. She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Blood money. That's what it was. And I took it anyway." Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Claire's brutal honesty was making her job harder to argue for leniency when the client was systematically destroying any foundation for a defense. "Miss Sterling," Patricia began, but Claire cut her off. "No, he needs to hear this. They all need to hear it." Claire's eyes fixed on Jake with desperate intensity. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I want you to understand that I didn't wake up one day and decide to be evil. I just made one compromise, then another, until I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who I'd become." Jake leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "When did you realize what you'd actually done? When did you understand that you were destroying families?" Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a confession she'd been holding for years. "There was an email. 2018, I think. A woman, single mother nurse, perfect credit score. She'd applied 3 times for a 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights, each time rejected. She sent an email asking why, begging for an explanation. Her kids were in the local school district. She needed to stay in the area." Claire's voice broke completely. "The email it broke my heart. For the first time I saw the person behind the application, saw what I was actually doing." "What did you do?" "I rejected her application again, because that was my job." Tears spilled over, running down her face unchecked. "I hit delete on her email and approved another application from someone who made less money, but had the right last name and the right zip code. And that night I went home and threw up. Just stood over my toilet and vomited until there was nothing left." Ryan's pen had stopped moving. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable, as if hearing details she hadn't been prepared for. "After that I started looking for another job," Claire continued. "But my resume was all Sterling. Nobody else would touch me once they saw where I'd worked. The company's reputation in the industry was complicated. People knew. Not specifics, but they knew." "So you stayed," Jake said. "I stayed until January 2020. Then I quit. Didn't have another job lined up, just quit. Started working for a mid-size firm doing generic corporate contracts. Nothing involving housing, nothing involving discrimination. I thought I could just start over. Pretend it never happened." "You met Andrew 6 months later." Claire nodded. "He was kind, honest, completely unaware of anything I'd done. And when he proposed, I said yes, because I thought maybe I could build a new life and leave the old one buried." Ryan cleared his throat. "Ms. Sterling, for the record, did you attempt to report Sterling Property Group's discriminatory practices to any regulatory authority?" "No." The word came out flat, defeated. "I was too scared. I told myself that someone else would report it, that it wasn't my responsibility. But the truth is, I was just a coward." Patricia finally intervened. "I think we've established the basic facts of my client's involvement and her current willingness to cooperate. Perhaps we can discuss the terms of that cooperation." But Claire wasn't finished. She pulled an envelope from somewhere within her purse, sliding it across the table toward Jake. "I need you to have this. It's a letter I wrote 3 years ago and never sent. To you specifically, though, I didn't know your name then. I just addressed it to the investigator who would eventually find me." Jake opened the envelope, carefully unfolding pages covered in handwriting that started neat and became increasingly erratic, as if written over multiple sessions by someone whose composure deteriorated with each word. He began reading silently, but Ryan leaned over to see, and the words seemed important enough to speak aloud. "To whoever is reading this, By the time you find this letter, you'll probably know what I did at Sterling Property Group. You'll know about the families I hurt, the algorithms I created, the system I helped build and perpetuate. I want you to know that I know it was wrong. I've known for years. The handwriting grew larger, more urgent. I tell myself I was young, that I was pressured, that I didn't understand the implications. But those are lies. I knew. Every time I clicked reject on an application, I knew I was hurting someone. I just didn't let myself think about them as real people. They were data points, statistics, applications to process. If I'd thought of them as families, as children who needed stable homes, as parents working hard to provide, I couldn't have done it. So I trained myself not to think of them at all. Ryan leaned closer to read over Jake's shoulder. The worst part is that I was good at it, efficient. I processed more applications than anyone else in the department. They gave me awards for my productivity. And every award was built on families I'd denied lives. I'd disrupted children whose parents couldn't give them the stability they deserved because I clicked a button. The final paragraph was barely legible, the pen having pressed so hard it nearly tore through the paper. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I hope whoever finds this understands that some of us who perpetuate evil systems aren't monsters. We're just weak. We're cowards who chose comfort over conscience. And we carry that choice for the rest of our lives. Silence filled the interview room when Jake finished reading. Even Patricia seemed affected, her professional mask slipping to reveal something that might have been pity or disgust. Maybe both. Jake refolded the letter carefully. When did you write this? November 2021, right after I changed my last name back to Sterling from Morrison. I thought maybe if I wrote it down, if I admitted what I'd done, I could start to atone somehow. But I never sent it, just kept it in my drawer like a confession I was too scared to make. Why give it to me now? Because you're going to prosecute me anyway, and I'd rather you know that I understood what I did was wrong even if I wasn't brave enough to stop it. Ryan glanced at Jake, a silent question. Do we need anything else? Jake shook his head. They had more than enough. This broken woman surrounded by the ruins of the life she'd tried to build on the foundation of other people's suffering. Patricia stood gathering papers. My client is willing to provide full testimony regarding Sterling Property Group's discriminatory practices, including technical documentation of the software algorithms and email correspondence with other companies who purchased the system. In exchange, we'd like to discuss a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Ryan nodded. We'll arrange that. Miss Sterling should expect to be charged, but her cooperation will be noted in any sentencing recommendations. Claire didn't seem to hear them. Her eyes were fixed on Jake, searching his face for something understanding, maybe, or absolution she knew he couldn't give. Your family, she said quietly. The Carters. I found your application in the archives. Dennis and Linda Carter applying for a 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights, August 2008. Jake felt his chest tighten. You remember it specifically? No. That's the thing. I didn't remember it at all until I went looking after I saw you at the wedding. It was just one of hundreds. But I found it in the old files. Rejected by automated system, flagged for cultural fit concerns, which was code for, I know what it was code for. Claire's voice broke completely. I didn't personally reject your family. The system was already in place when I started, but I maintained it. I improved it. I made it more efficient at doing exactly what it did to your parents. She looked at him with eyes that held nothing but devastation. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't help, doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. Jake stood, needing to put distance between himself and this woman's anguish before it infected him with something that felt dangerously close to sympathy. She'd helped destroy his childhood, had been part of a system that humiliated his parents and forced his family into a motel that charged by the week. Her tears didn't change that, but the letter in his hand suggested she'd been drowning in guilt for years, carrying the weight of what she'd done while lacking the courage to make it right. That didn't excuse anything. It didn't reduce her culpability or diminish the harm she'd caused, but it complicated the simple narrative of monster and victim. added shades of gray to what Jake had wanted to be black and white. "We'll be in touch about the cooperation agreement." He managed his voice rougher than intended. "Don't leave the state." Outside the interview room, Ryan walked beside him in silence until they reached the parking garage. "That was rough," Ryan said finally. Jake pulled his keys from his pocket, hands not quite steady. "She's not what I expected." Perpetrators rarely are. We build them up as monsters in our heads because it's easier to hate monsters than to hate people who just made terrible choices. She made those choices for years, Ryan. She took bonuses for destroying families. I know, and she'll go to prison for it. But after listening to that interview, I think prison might be the least of her punishment. She's going to carry this guilt for the rest of her life. Jake unlocked his car, but didn't get in, standing instead in the parking garage's concrete chill, trying to organize thoughts that refused to settle into neat categories. Justice and revenge. Victim and perpetrator. Forgiveness and accountability. Every concept seemed to bleed into the others, creating muddy waters where he'd wanted clear distinctions. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Mr. Carter, this is Andrew Bennett. Claire's—" I don't know what to call her now. "We need to talk. There's something you should know about my company's involvement. I'm at the Charlotte Marriott, room 347. Please." Jake showed Ryan the message. The agent frowned. "Could be a trap. Sterling's people trying to intimidate you. Or it could be another witness ready to cooperate. Either way, you shouldn't go alone. I'll come with you." The Charlotte Marriott was 15 minutes from the field office, a modern building that catered to business travelers. Room 347 was on the third floor at the end of a corridor decorated with generic landscape prints. Jake knocked. Movement inside, followed by a pause, probably checking the peephole before the door opened. Andrew Bennett had changed from his tuxedo into jeans and a polo shirt, his hair disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. His eyes were red, his face carrying the hollow shock of someone whose world had just imploded. "Thank you for coming." He stepped back, allowing Jake and Ryan to enter. The room was standard hotel king bed, desk chair, television showing muted news coverage of the arrests at the wedding. Andrew moved to the desk where his laptop sat open beside scattered papers. "I didn't know where else to turn. I've been going through my files since the FBI let me leave, trying to understand how I didn't see this coming. And I found something." He turned the laptop to face them. The screen showed what appeared to be a financial report, columns of numbers and corporate names. "Bennett Capital Investments, my firm. We've been Sterling Property Group's primary lender since 2015, $47 million in various loans and credit facilities over that period. I personally underwrote $12 million of it." Ryan moved closer to examine the screen. "You're saying your firm financed Sterling's operations?" "Not just financed, we knew what they were doing." Andrew's voice cracked. "These emails, I found them in my sent folder, but I don't remember writing them. Or maybe I didn't want to remember." He clicked to open an email chain. Jake read over Ryan's shoulder, his stomach sinking with each line. From Andrew Bennett, Jr. to William Sterling, Q3 Performance Review. Bill, excellent quarter. Rental operations showing strong margins as usual. Appreciate the focus on maintaining property values through selective tenant screening. Our investors love the stability you've achieved in your developments. Approved your request for additional $3 million credit line to expand the screening software project. Ryan pulled out his phone, photographing the screen. "You knew about the screening software." "I thought it was just normal business practice." Andrew's hands shook as he scrolled through more emails. "Sterling always talked about maintaining standards, protecting property values. He made it sound like smart business management, not discrimination. And I wanted to believe him because he was my biggest client and Claire's father, and—" He broke off, pressing his palms against his eyes. When he lowered them, tears tracked down his face. "I married her 6 hours ago, promised to love and protect her, and now I find out everything about her was a lie. And everything about my own career is built on the same lies. How did I not see it?" Jake felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this man who'd had his wedding day and his illusions destroyed simultaneously. "You saw what you wanted to see. what it was convenient to see. That's not good enough. I'm supposed to be smart, supposed to do due diligence, but I just took Sterling's word for everything because questioning him would have been uncomfortable. Andrew pulled something from his pocket, his wedding ring. He turned it over in his hands, the gold catching the room's harsh light. I put this on her finger this morning. We made vows. And now, he looked at Jake with desperate hope. Is there any way to make this right? Any way to help the families who were hurt? Ryan's voice carried no judgment, just statement of fact. Those emails implicate you in knowing participation in discriminatory practices. At minimum, that's civil liability, potentially criminal depending on what else we find. I'll cooperate. Full disclosure, whatever you need. Andrew looked at Jake. Is there anything I can do? Any way to help the families who were hurt? Jake thought about his father's words echoing in his mind. You got your justice. Now let it go. But sitting in this hotel room with a man whose life was unraveling and a woman who'd been drowning in guilt for years, justice felt less like victory and more like a burden everyone would carry forward. There's a fund, he heard himself say. Restitution for affected families. If you're serious about making things right, you could contribute. Help track down families who were denied housing. Provide them compensation. Yes, absolutely. How much? That's between you and your lawyers. But significant. Life-changing amounts for the families who lost opportunities because of Sterling's practices. Andrew nodded, wiping his face. I'll do it. Whatever it takes. I can't undo what happened, but I can at least try to help fix it. Ryan continued photographing emails and financial documents while Jake watched the news coverage of the arrests. The reporters had gotten wind of the basic story: prominent real estate developer arrested at daughter's wedding, allegations of systematic housing discrimination, but they didn't have details yet. That would come later when the federal indictments were unsealed and the full scope of Sterling's operation became public. His phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. Mr. Carter, this is Victoria Sterling, William's wife. I need to speak with you. Not about the case, not about charges or cooperation, about my daughter as a person. Please, I'm in the lobby of your hotel. Jake glanced at Ryan, who shrugged. Your call. Give me 5 minutes. Victoria Sterling sat in a wing-back chair near the hotel lobby's fireplace, a woman in her late 60s with a kind of tired elegance that suggested she'd once been quite beautiful, but had been worn down by life's complications. She wore sensible slacks and a cardigan, no jewelry, her face free of makeup and streaked with the evidence of recent crying. She stood when Jake approached, extending a hand that trembled slightly. Thank you for seeing me. I know you have no reason to. They sat in adjacent chairs, the fireplace providing more ambiance than actual warmth. Jake waited, letting her gather whatever thoughts had brought her here. Claire is my only child. Victoria began, her voice steady despite the tears threatening. I know what she did was wrong, unconscionable really, but I need you to understand that she wasn't always like this. She used to volunteer at homeless shelters. She tutored kids from low-income families. She wanted to use her law degree to help people. What changed? Debt, fear, the weight of expectations. Victoria's hands twisted in her lap. We mortgaged our house to help with her undergraduate education, took out loans for ourselves to ease her burden. She knew how much we'd sacrificed, and she felt like she had to make it worth something, had to succeed financially, prove the investment was justified. Jake kept his voice gentle. That doesn't excuse what she did. No, it doesn't. But I want you to know that every time she came home for Christmas or Thanksgiving, she seemed a little more hollow, a little more distant, like something was eating her from the inside. Victoria pulled tissues from her purse, dabbing at eyes that kept filling despite her efforts. Last year she told me she'd made terrible mistakes. Wouldn't say what, just that she'd hurt people and didn't know how to fix it. I thought she was talking about a relationship, a professional error. I never imagined the scale. Did you know about her work at Sterling Property? I knew she worked there. I knew she'd quit suddenly. But she said it was because of a hostile work environment that she wanted a fresh start. I believed her because I'm her mother, and I wanted to believe. The fireplace crackled, a log shifting and sending up sparks. Somewhere in the hotel, a child laughed, the sound incongruous against the heaviness of their conversation. "Mr. Carter, I'm not here to ask for leniency. Claire deserves whatever punishment the law provides. But I wanted you to know that she's not a monster. She's a person who made catastrophic choices, who let fear and weakness override her conscience. And she's been punishing herself for years, even before you found her." Jake thought about the letter, about Claire's tear-stained face in the interview room, about the guilt she'd apparently carried while still trying to build a new life. "Mrs. Sterling, I appreciate you telling me this, but it doesn't change what needs to happen. Your daughter participated in systematic discrimination that affected thousands of families. She needs to be held accountable." "I know." Victoria stood, gathering her purse. "I just wanted you to see her as human, because I think it's easy to hate abstractions, the people who denied your family housing. But it's harder to hate actual people with their own pain and regret." She left before Jake could respond, her words hanging in the lobby air long after she'd disappeared through the exit. Ryan emerged from the elevator, his expression troubled. "We've got a problem. Sterling's lawyer just filed an emergency motion claiming that your presence at the wedding constitutes entrapment and that all evidence gathered should be suppressed." "That's ridiculous. I had a valid invitation and documented ongoing discrimination." "I know, and the motion will fail, but it's going to make things messy. They're arguing that you had personal animus, that the investigation was compromised by your family's history with Sterling Property Group, that you manipulated the situation to create grounds for arrest." Jake felt anger rising sharp and hot. "I spent 6 years building an airtight case. Every piece of evidence was legally obtained. Every procedure followed to the letter. And they know that. This is delay tactics, trying to buy time to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. But it means we need to be extra careful going forward. No contact with the Sterling family without witnesses present. No informal conversations. Everything by the book." They walked back to the parking garage, Jake's mind racing through implications and complications. He'd known Sterling would fight, had expected expensive lawyers and aggressive defense strategies. But the entrapment claim struck close to home because it contained a grain of truth. His presence at the wedding had been personal, had been motivated by more than just professional duty. Ryan, honest question. If my family hadn't been among the denied applications, would I still have pursued this case? The agent was quiet for a moment, considering. Probably. You're good at your job and you care about housing justice, but would you have pursued it with the same intensity, the same single-minded focus? Maybe not. So they're right. It was personal. Personal doesn't mean wrong, Jake. Justice can be both personal and legitimate. The people hurt by Sterling's practices deserved an advocate who cared enough to see it through. And that's what they got. Jake climbed into his car, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but Charlotte, anywhere but surrounded by the wreckage of the past few days. The drive back to Charleston took him through downtown, past restaurants where people laughed over dinner, past bars where Saturday night celebrations continued, oblivious to federal arrests and ruined weddings. Normal life. The kind Jake had sacrificed in pursuit of this case in service of justice that now felt more complicated than he'd wanted it to be. His hotel room was generic, corporate queen bed, desk, television, bathroom with individually wrapped toiletries. He'd stayed in hundreds of rooms like this over the years, temporary spaces that never quite felt like home, because home meant roots and commitment, and Jake had built his life around being able to pack up and chase the next investigation. He sat on the bed and finally allowed himself to process everything. Claire's tears, Victoria's quiet plea, Andrew's shocked betrayal, the Colonel's arrest, 6 years of work culminating in a single afternoon of controlled chaos. And instead of triumph, Jake felt hollowed out, as if the thing that had driven him for so long had been excised, leaving only empty space. His phone rang. Dad. "Hey, I was going to call. Jake, I need you to listen without interrupting." Dennis's voice carried an urgency that cut through Jake's exhaustion. "Your mother and I have been talking about the case, about what happened today, about the last 6 years of your life." "Dad, I'm fine." "I said don't interrupt. "Son, we're proud of you. What you did took courage and dedication and a kind of strength most people can't imagine. You stood up for families who couldn't stand up for themselves. You held powerful people accountable for their cruelty. That matters." Jake heard his mother's voice in the background urging Dennis to continue. "But we're also worried about you. We see the way this case has consumed your life. No relationships, no hobbies, nothing but work, and more work. Chasing justice that sometimes feels like revenge in disguise. And we don't want you to wake up at 50 and realize you spent your whole life fighting their wrongs instead of building your own life. I'm building something important. You're building a wall, son. A wall between yourself and everyone who might get close enough to hurt you. And yes, what happened to us was painful. Yes, being denied that apartment was humiliating and wrong, but we survived it. We moved on. We found another place. Raised you and Emily. Built a good life despite the setback." Dennis's voice grew firmer. "You don't get to let what they did to us 16 years ago destroy your present and your future. You hear me? You proved your point. You got your justice. Now you need to let it go and figure out who Jake Carter is when he's not hunting the next bad guy." Jake felt tears pricking his eyes, exhaustion and emotion overwhelming his usual control. "I don't know how to do that." "I know. That's why I'm telling you. Start small. Take a vacation. Go on a date. Read a book that has nothing to do with housing law. Learn to cook something besides frozen dinners. Just live, Jake. For yourself, not for some mission." After the call ended, Jake sat in the dark hotel room and let himself cry for the first time in years. For his parents and their humiliation. For the families denied housing because of algorithms designed to exclude them. For Claire Sterling drowning in guilt. For Andrew Bennett's shattered illusions. For the child he'd been who'd vowed revenge, and the man he'd become who'd mistaken that revenge for purpose. And for the hollow space inside himself where something vital should have been, something that had been carved out piece by piece until justice was all that remained. Outside, Charlotte's Saturday night continued in laughter and music and the simple pleasures of people living their lives. Inside room 412, a federal investigator who'd won his case sat alone and wondered why victory felt so much like loss. 6 months transformed Asheville's autumn scandal into Charlotte's spring trial. Jake sat in the federal courthouse gallery watching attorneys present evidence he'd spent years collecting, feeling disconnected from the proceedings as if observing someone else's work. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, housing advocates, families who'd been denied homes, curiosity seekers drawn by headlines about discrimination software and wedding day arrests. Judge Marcus Williams presided, a black man in his 60s who'd built his career on civil rights litigation before ascending to the federal bench. Claire Sterling took the stand on a Tuesday morning in late March, her hair pulled back severely, her navy suit conservative enough to signal contrition without performing it. The prosecutor, a woman named Janet Reeves, who'd earned her reputation dismantling white-collar fraud schemes, approached the witness box with controlled precision. "Ms. Sterling, please describe your role in developing the tenant optimization system." Claire's voice came out steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was the primary architect. I designed the algorithm that analyzed rental applications and assigned risk scores based on multiple factors including zip code, employer type, educational background, and what we internally called cultural compatibility indicators." What did cultural compatibility mean? It meant filtering out applicants who didn't match the demographic profile Sterling Property Group wanted for their properties. We used proxy indicators, certain first names, certain addresses, certain types of employment to identify and reject applicants without explicitly referencing protected classes. Reeves pulled up a document on the courtroom's projection screen, lines of code interspersed with developer comments. "Can you explain this notation here where it says, 'Flag appellation surnames for additional review'?" Claire's composure cracked fractionally. "That was my code. I wrote it in 2017. The idea was that families from certain regions, particularly rural Appalachia, were more likely to be what we considered high-risk tenants. So, applications with surnames common to those areas triggered additional scrutiny that almost always resulted in rejection. Jake felt his jaw tighten. His own surname, Carter, was common throughout West Virginia coal country, where families like his had mined and worked and built communities for generations. Claire had coded discrimination against his entire heritage into an algorithm that ran automatically rejecting families before human eyes ever reviewed their qualifications. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Theodore Caldwell, who specialized in corporate litigation, cross-examined with surgical precision. Ms. Sterling, you've testified that you were pressured into designing this system, that your supervisor threatened you with bar complaints if you refused. Correct? Yes. Yet you continued working at Sterling Property Group for 4 years. You received bonuses, promotions. You even helped sell the software to other companies. Does that sound like someone acting under duress? Claire's eyes dropped to her hands. No. It sounds like someone who prioritized her own comfort over doing what was right. The honesty seemed to catch Caldwell off guard. He'd expected deflection, justification, anything but this stark acknowledgement of culpability. You're saying you chose to participate in these discriminatory practices? I'm saying I was given opportunities to stop, to report what was happening, to refuse to continue. And I didn't take them. I told myself I had no choice, but that was a lie. I always had a choice, I just lacked the courage to make it. Jake watched the jury's faces shift. Hardened skepticism giving way to something more complicated. Claire wasn't performing remorse for tactical advantage. She was excavating her own failures in real time, offering no excuses that might soften the judgment she clearly believed she deserved. The trial continued through March into April. Witness after witness detailing the mechanics of Sterling's discrimination network. Former employees described quotas for rejection rates. Technical experts analyzed the software's decision trees, demonstrating how neutral-sounding criteria systematically excluded protected groups. Families testified about being denied housing despite perfect qualifications, about the confusion and humiliation of inexplicable rejections. Jake provided testimony on a Wednesday afternoon, his 6 years of investigation distilled into 3 hours of questions and answers. He recounted discovering the pattern, tracing the software sales, building the case brick by evidentiary brick. When Reeves asked about his family's application, he kept his voice level and professional. In August 2008, my parents applied for a 2-bedroom apartment at Riverside Heights. My father was a coal miner with 18 years' experience. My mother was a registered nurse. Their combined income was 3 times the monthly rent. Their credit score was 780. They were rejected within 48 hours. Did Sterling Property Group provide a reason? Insufficient financial qualifications, which was objectively false. The real reason was that their zip code, Beckley, West Virginia, had been flagged in the system as undesirable. Working-class families from coal country didn't fit Sterling's vision for their premium properties. What impact did this rejection have on your family? Jake paused, allowing himself to remember for the first time in months. We spent 8 months in a weekly rate motel. My sister had to change schools mid-year. My mother developed depression that required medication. My father started drinking more than he should. The rejection itself was bad. But the not knowing why, the sense that we'd been judged and found wanting despite doing everything right, that was devastating. Colonel Sterling sat at the defense table throughout the trial, his military posture never wavering, his face betraying nothing. But when Jake testified, something flickered in the old man's eyes, not quite remorse, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that his business practices had consequences measured in actual human suffering rather than abstract liability. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. When they returned on a Friday afternoon, the courtroom fell silent in that particular way that precedes verdicts, everyone holding breath and judgment in equal measure. The foreperson, a middle-aged black woman who'd served as an elementary school principal before retiring, stood with the verdict sheet steady in her hands. On the charge of conspiracy to violate the Fair Housing Act, we find the defendant William Sterling guilty. Victoria Sterling's composure finally shattered, a sound escaping her throat that might have been grief or rage or simple disbelief. The colonel remained motionless, staring straight ahead as if at attention. On the charge of racketeering through the creation and distribution of discriminatory software, we find the defendant guilty. Jake felt something loosen in his chest. 6 years of tension releasing all at once. Ryan Chen sat beside him in the gallery, their shoulders touching briefly in shared acknowledgement. The guilty verdicts continued. 12 counts. 12 affirmations that Sterling's practices had violated federal law, had damaged families, had weaponized the housing market against people who lacked the right backgrounds or addresses or surnames. When the foreperson finished, she sat down heavily as if the weight of judgment had physically exhausted her. Judge Williams set sentencing for 6 weeks later. The colonel was led away in handcuffs, standard procedure despite his age and standing, while Victoria sat alone at the defense table surrounded by lawyers who'd failed to protect her husband from accountability. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Jake declined interviews, pushing through the crowd toward his car, but a voice stopped him, familiar despite months of silence. "Mr. Carter, please, just a moment." Victoria Sterling stood at the edge of the media scrum, looking smaller than she had in the hotel lobby months ago, diminished by the verdict and its implications. Jake gestured for her to follow him away from the cameras, finding relative privacy in a parking garage stairwell that smelled of concrete and exhaust fumes. "I know you have no reason to listen to me." Victoria's voice was hoarse, as if she'd been crying for hours. "But I wanted to thank you." "Thank me. Your husband is going to prison. My husband destroyed thousands of lives and got rich doing it. He deserved this verdict." She pulled an envelope from her purse, pressing it into Jake's hands. "This is a letter from Claire. She's not allowed to contact you directly because of the cooperation agreement, but she asked me to give you this. You don't have to read it. You can throw it away if you want. But she wrote it, and I promised I'd deliver it." Victoria left before Jake could refuse, disappearing into the parking garage's shadows. He stood holding the envelope, debating whether to simply toss it in the nearest trash can. What could Claire possibly say that mattered now? What words could address the damage her algorithms had inflicted? But curiosity, or maybe something else, some need for closure, he didn't want to examine, made him open it. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages covered in the same erratic script as the earlier confession. "Mr. Carter, I know I have no right to write to you, no right to ask for your time or attention, but there are things I need you to know. Not because they excuse anything, but because silence feels like continued cowardice. I've spent the past 6 months in therapy trying to understand how I became someone capable of what I did. My therapist says I was institutionalized, that Sterling Property Group created a culture where discrimination was normalized, even rewarded, and I absorbed that culture without questioning it deeply enough. But that's still an excuse. Plenty of people worked at Sterling and found ways to resist, to report, to refuse. I wasn't one of them. What I've realized is that I was terrified of being poor. My family wasn't wealthy. We were solidly middle class, but always one emergency away from financial disaster. When I graduated with all that debt, the fear of ending up like the families I later denied housing, that fear became paralyzing. So I made a devil's bargain. I'd do terrible things to ensure I never experienced the vulnerability and humiliation that comes with economic precarity. The cruelest irony is that I became the thing I feared most. Not poor, but morally bankrupt. I traded my integrity for a paycheck and told myself I didn't have a choice, when really I just lacked courage. I'm going to prison. 3 to 5 years, my lawyer says, though with cooperation credit may be less, and I deserve every day of it. But what happens after? How do I live with what I've done? How do I contribute anything meaningful when I've caused so much harm? I'm working with a non-profit now, teaching formerly incarcerated women about housing rights. It's a drop in the ocean compared to the damage I caused, but it's something. When I'm released, I want to dedicate whatever life I have left to fighting the same systems I helped build. Not for redemption. I don't believe I can be redeemed, but because it's the only way I know to honor the families I hurt. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your investigation changed more than just the law. It changed me, forced me to see myself clearly for the first time in years. And while that vision is ugly and painful, it's also true. And truth, however late it arrives, matters. Thank you for not letting us hide. Thank you for being brave when I was a coward." Jake refolded the letter, slipping it into his jacket pocket. He felt no softening toward Claire, no impulse to forgive or minimize her role in the discrimination network. But the letter complicated his anger, added dimension to someone he'd needed to see as simply villainous. Sentencing arrived on a Tuesday in early May, the courthouse gardens blooming with dogwoods and azaleas that seemed incongruous against the gravity of the proceedings. Judge Williams surveyed the courtroom before beginning his expression grave. "Colonel Sterling, you didn't just violate the Fair Housing Act. You industrialized that violation. You created tools that allowed discrimination to operate at scale efficiently, systematically. You turned prejudice into profit." The colonel stood to receive his sentence, his shoulders back despite the weight of judgment descending. "You'll serve 12 years in federal prison. Additionally, you're ordered to pay $15 million in fines and restitution to the victims of your discriminatory practices. Your company's Sterling Property Group will be dissolved and its assets liquidated to fund a victim compensation program." Victoria collapsed into her lawyer's arms, her sobs audible across the courtroom. The colonel's face remained impassive, accepting the sentence with military stoicism that suggested he'd already made peace with this outcome. Claire received 4 years reduced from the original 7 because of her cooperation and genuine remorse. 3 executives who'd knowingly participated in the scheme received sentences ranging from 2 to 6 years. Lower-level employees who'd simply followed orders without understanding the full scope were given probation and community service. Andrew Bennett faced no criminal charges, but agreed to contribute $3 million to the restitution fund and perform 500 hours of community service. After the sentencing, Claire asked to see Jake one final time. They met in a courthouse conference room, Claire still in handcuffs, a bailiff standing by the door. She looked smaller, somehow diminished by the orange jumpsuit that would be her uniform for the next 4 years. "Thank you for not objecting to my plea deal." Jake kept his voice neutral. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because the families need your testimony to go after the other 11 companies." "I know, but still thank you." She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "When I get out, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to undo some of the damage. Not because I think it'll make me whole, but because it's the only thing I can do. 4 years in prison, then a lifetime of penance. That's a long road. Shorter than the one your family walked. Shorter than what 847 families went through because of what I built." Jake stood to leave, then paused. "The letter you wrote. The one your mother gave me." Claire looked up, hope and fear mixing on her face. "I read it. And I believe you meant it. So when you get out, do what you said. Fight the systems you helped create. It won't erase what you did, but it might mean something to the next family facing rejection. It will. I promise. Don't promise me. Promise the families you hurt. Promise the kids who had to change schools mid-year. Promise the parents who cried in motel rooms. They're the ones who deserve your promises, not me." He left before she could respond, leaving Claire sitting alone in the conference room with the weight of promises she'd spend the rest of her life trying to keep. 6 months after sentencing, Jake stood in the Dennis Carter Community Housing Rights Center watching children play in a newly renovated gymnasium while their parents attended a workshop in the adjacent classroom. The building had been purchased with settlement funds and named for his family, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt both honoring and uncomfortable. His father stood beside him, leaning on a cane now due to worsening back problems from decades in the mines, but his eyes were bright as he watched the activity. "Your mother would have loved this, seeing something good built from all that pain." Linda Carter had passed 2 months earlier, a stroke that came suddenly and stole her before the family could gather. Jake had delivered a eulogy that tried to capture her strength and gentleness, her ability to maintain hope even through the darkest periods. But what he kept coming back to was a conversation they'd had shortly before her death, when the settlement was being finalized. "Baby, I need you to promise me something." Her voice had been weak, her hand trembling in his. "When this is all done, the trials, the sentencing, the restitution, I need you to let it go. Build something new instead of spending the rest of your life fighting old battles. Mama, there are still 11 companies using Sterling software, still thousands of families. And there always will be, Jake. There will always be more injustice, more fights to fight. But you can't save everyone. And if you spend your whole life trying, you'll forget how to save yourself." He'd promised, holding her frail hand, knowing she was right but not yet ready to accept it. Her death had forced that acceptance, had created a before and after that demanded he consider what came next. Dennis turned from the window, studying his son's face. "You've been different since the funeral. Quieter. I've been thinking about what Mama said, about building something new, and I don't know what that looks like yet. My whole adult life has been about this case, about holding Sterling accountable. Now that it's done, I feel untethered." Dennis nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Let me tell you something I learned in the mines. When you're working underground, you need an anchor point, something solid to tether yourself to in case of collapse or gas. Most men use the job as their anchor. The work becomes who they are, and when the mine closes or they retire or get injured, they fall apart because they've lost the thing that held them together." He leaned heavily on his cane. "I didn't fall apart when I had to stop mining because I'd built other anchor points. Your mother, you and Emily, the community fishing, teaching other men to fix engines. I knew who Dennis Carter was beyond the mine." Dennis met Jake's eyes directly. "You need to figure out who Jake Carter is beyond the investigation." The words settled into Jake's chest with the weight of truth he'd been avoiding. He'd become HUD investigator Carter so completely that the man underneath had almost disappeared. "I've been offered a promotion, Director of Fair Housing Enforcement for the entire Southeast region based in Atlanta. Big job, more responsibility, more cases, more impact. And I'm thinking about turning it down." Dennis's eyebrows rose. "That would surprise me if I didn't see the exhaustion in your eyes. You're burned out, son." "I'm 38 years old. I should be in my prime, ready to take on bigger challenges. Instead, I feel like I've been running a marathon for 6 years and just realized there's no finish line." "Then stop running. Take the director job or don't. Either choice is valid, but make it based on what you want to build, not what you're running from or toward." They walked through the community center together, Dennis's cane tapping against polished floors that had been refinished by volunteers from the neighborhood. In the housing rights workshop, an attorney was explaining tenant protections to families who'd been denied apartments through Sterling's system or similar practices at other companies. Their faces showed concentration mixed with the particular weariness that comes from being systematically excluded from learning not to trust systems that claim to be fair. Jake recognized that weariness. He'd seen it in his parents' eyes after their rejection, the way they'd approached every subsequent housing application with defensive anticipation of disappointment. Breaking through that learned helplessness required more than just legal victories. It required rebuilding trust one interaction at a time. The workshop facilitator noticed Jake and waved him over. Rachel Morrison, 36, civil rights attorney who'd joined the nonprofit after leaving a corporate firm that defended exactly the kind of discrimination she now fought against. They'd met at a housing rights conference 3 months ago, discovered a shared passion for tenant advocacy, and tentatively begun something that might become personal if Jake could figure out how to let someone past the walls he'd built. "Mr. Carter, we were just discussing the Sterling settlement. Would you mind sharing how families can apply for compensation?" Jake found himself at the front of the room facing 20 people whose applications had been systematically rejected, explaining the claims process and documentation requirements. But partway through, he shifted from procedure to something more personal. "I know this settlement doesn't undo the harm. You lost years' opportunities, stability. Some of you had to move away from jobs or schools or family. Some ended up in unsafe housing because that's all you could access. Money can't fix that completely." A woman in her 40s raised her hand, her voice carrying an edge of anger that Jake understood intimately. then why should we bother with the claims process? Why go through the humiliation of proving we were discriminated against when we already know we were? Jake thought about his mother crying in that motel room, about his father shaking hands, about Emily asking why they weren't good enough. Because documentation matters. Because every claim filed becomes evidence that this harm was real and widespread. Because the families who come after you deserve to inherit a system that's been forced to change. And because getting some compensation, even partial, is better than letting the people who hurt you keep every penny they made from your exclusion. The woman nodded slowly, her anger not dissipating but channeling toward something productive. After the workshop, Rachel walked with Jake to the parking lot, her hand finding his with the casual comfort of growing intimacy. "You're good at this, connecting with people who've been hurt, better than in courtrooms." "Courtrooms are about justice. This is about something else. Healing, maybe, or at least acknowledgement that the harm was real." They'd been dating for 2 months, taking things slowly, building toward something real rather than rushing into relationship as distraction from other problems. Rachel made space for his healing without demanding he be already healed. "Have you decided about the director position?" "I'm turning it down. I need time away from investigations, from building cases, from chasing the next Sterling. I want to focus on this, helping families understand their rights, maybe preventing some discrimination before it happens rather than just prosecuting it after." Rachel squeezed his hand. "Your dad would be proud." "He already told me he is, which is good because I'm still figuring out how to be proud of myself." They stood in the parking lot as evening settled over Charleston, the community center's lights warm against gathering darkness. Inside, families continued learning about their rights, building knowledge that might protect them from future discrimination. It wasn't enough, would never be enough to truly balance the scales. But it was something real and tangible and good. Jake's phone buzzed. A message from Ryan Chen. Final count. Sterling software used at 11 companies affected an estimated 4,200 families over 12 years. Your case triggered investigations at all 11 companies. 6 have already settled. The other 5 go to trial next year. You did it, Jake. You actually did it. Jake typed back, "We did it. Couldn't have built the case without FBI support. What's next for you?" "Taking some time. Running the community center, helping families, figuring out what comes after justice." "Sounds good. You earned the break. But if you ever want back indoors, always open." Jake pocketed his phone and turned to Rachel. "Dinner." "Only if you're buying. Civil rights attorneys don't make HUD investigator money." "Former HUD investigator. And yes, I'm buying." They drove to a small Italian restaurant in downtown Charleston, the kind of place where the servers knew regular customers, and the food was simple but excellent. Over pasta and wine, they talked about everything except housing discrimination, about Rachel's family in Atlanta, about Jake's sister Emily's new baby, about the simple pleasure of being present in a moment without constantly thinking 3 steps ahead to the next case, the next investigation, the next battle. Rachel reached across the table, taking his hand. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you regret it? The 6 years, the obsession, the single-minded focus on bringing Sterling down." Jake thought about his mother's death, about the promotion he was turning down, about the relationships he'd never built because he'd been too busy chasing justice. "I regret that it cost so much, but I don't regret doing it." 847 families got answers about why they were rejected. 4,000 more will get compensation. 11 companies have been forced to abandon discriminatory practices. That matters. But my mom was right. I need to figure out how to build something instead of just tearing down broken systems. How to help families before they're hurt instead of just avenging them after. Rachel smiled. "Sounds like you already know what comes next." "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of being angry." They finished dinner and walked along Charleston's waterfront, watching sailboats drift past in the cooling evening air. Jake thought about Colonel Sterling serving the first months of a 12-year sentence in a federal prison. About Claire Sterling teaching housing rights to incarcerated women while serving her own time. About Andrew Bennett writing checks and hoping money could assuage guilt. And he thought about the Dennis Carter Community Housing Rights Center, about families learning their rights, about children playing in a gymnasium named for his father. Justice delivered. Promises kept. A system held accountable, at least in this one small corner of the world. Rachel leaned against him as they walked, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest, the wall he'd built around himself cracking just enough to let someone else in. "What are you thinking about?" Rachel asked. "That my mom told me to build something new. That my dad told me to figure out who I am beyond the investigation. That maybe for the first time in 6 years I actually have the space to do both those things. And I'm terrified, but also ready." 3 months later, Jake stood at his father's bedside in the hospital holding Dennis Carter's hand as machines beeped their steady rhythm and morphine eased the pain that had become too much for even a coal miner's stubborn endurance to bear. Dennis's voice came out barely a whisper. "You did good, son. Made those people answer for what they did. Made sure it can't happen again, at least not the same way. I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You taught me to fight. Taught me that justice matters even when it takes 16 years. And now I'm teaching you to rest." Dennis squeezed Jake's hand with what little strength remained. "The center's going to help a lot of families. You're going to help a lot of families. Not by chasing bad guys, but by making sure people know their rights before the bad guys can hurt them." "I'm scared, Dad. Scared that without the investigation, without the mission, I won't know who I am. You're Jake Carter, my son, Linda's son, Emily's brother, Rachel's boyfriend if you're smart enough not to mess that up. You're a man who cares about justice but knows that justice is just the beginning, not the end, and you're going to be fine." Dennis closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. "Tell your mother I'm coming home. Tell her we won." He died 3 hours later with Jake and Emily holding his hands with Rachel waiting in the hall because she understood that this moment belonged to family. The funeral was small coal miners and nurses' neighbors from the old days and Beckley families from the community center who'd never met Dennis but knew what he'd meant to his son. Jake delivered the eulogy without breaking, talking about a man who'd worked 30 years in darkness so his children could live in light, who'd faced rejection with dignity, who'd taught his son that real strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every single time. Afterward, Rachel found him standing alone by the grave watching workers lower the casket into West Virginia soil. "He was proud of you. You know that, right?" "I know, but I wish I'd spent less time making him proud and more time just being with him. You had 6 years of investigation, but you had 38 years of being his son. Don't let the 6 years eclipse everything else." Jake pulled her close, letting himself lean on someone else for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Help me remember that. When I start thinking about taking on the next case, the next crusade, the next 16-year mission, help me remember that life is more than justice." "Deal. But only if you help me remember that justice still matters, even when we're trying to build something new." They stood together in the cemetery as afternoon light slanted through the trees, and Jake felt something fundamental shift inside himself. The investigation was over. The trial was finished. The sentence had been served. His father was gone. What remained was the question of what to build on the foundation of everything he'd learned. 1 year later, Jake stood in the Dennis and Linda Carter Community Housing Rights Center, expanded now to 3 buildings serving 6 neighborhoods, and watched his sister Emily's daughter cut the ribbon on the new children's education wing. 7 years old and fierce, she held the ceremonial scissors with the same determination her grandfather had brought to everything. "I declare this building open," she announced, and the small crowd applauded. Rachel stood beside Jake, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly, 5 months along, a daughter they'd already decided to name Linda. Emily caught Jake's eye across the room and smiled. They'd both survived the motel rooms, the rejection, the humiliation of being deemed unworthy. And they'd both built lives that honored their parents without being defined by what had been done to them. The center now employed 12 people, served 3,000 families a year, and had helped prevent an estimated 200 discriminatory rejections through proactive legal intervention and education. It wasn't enough to undo what Sterling had done. Could never be enough. but it was something real and growing and good. Jake's phone buzzed. A message from Ryan Chen. Last of the 11 companies just settled. $47 million total in restitution. 4,200 families getting compensation. Your case made it all possible. Congrats. Jake typed back, our case. Couldn't have done it alone. You coming back? We could use someone like you in Atlanta. No, I'm exactly where I need to be. He pocketed his phone and turned to Rachel, pulling her close. What are you thinking? She asked. That my dad was right. I'm Jake Carter, not Jake Carter, HUD investigator. Not Jake Carter, the man who brought down Sterling Property Group. Just Jake Carter, father-to-be, community center director, guy who's figuring out how to build instead of just fight. Sounds like a good person to be. It's a work in progress, but for the first time in 6 years, I'm okay with that. They stood together in the gymnasium named for his parents, watching children play and families learn, and a community slowly heal from wounds that had been invisible for far too long. Justice had been served. 12 years in prison for Colonel Sterling, 4 years for Claire, $47 million in restitution for 4,000 families, 11 companies forced to abandon discriminatory practices. But more important than any of that, more important than verdicts or settlements or prison sentences, was this a place where families could learn their rights, where rejection could be challenged, where the next generation wouldn't have to wonder why they weren't good enough. His father's voice echoed in memory one final time. Real discrimination doesn't shout. It smiles politely and closes the door right in your face. But real justice, Jake had learned, didn't shout either. It worked quietly, building systems of protection one family at a time, turning pain into purpose and rage into something that might actually help the people who came after. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was enough. And for the first time since he was 14 years old, watching his mother cry through motel walls, Jake Carter allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, enough was actually enough.